Hello and welcome to another VisFX Blender video breakdown. This week's project was the peanut butter and jelly instructional video. My name is Chris Folia and let's get started. So again, this week I used the Blender 2.5 tomato branch from the Google Summer of Code because I like the movie clip functionality. I think in future projects I'm going to be a little bit wiser and use the official build. That way I'll be able to use render farms, since this took like 20 something hours to render out the entire project. Moving into the scene here, it's very straightforward this week. We've got a couple layers here. On the first layer we have all of our models, and on the second layer we have some reflection maps, but let's break down the models before we go into explaining the reflection maps. The scene is completely hand animated. I didn't really do any simulations this week. It's just a whole bunch of tedious keyframe by keyframe animation here as we scroll through. One of the biggest problems I had with the CG this week was combining the CG with reality. So how I did that is I just decided to take my kitchen counter and rebuild it completely. However, the problem then persisted that the CG had to blend with the real counter in the background. So what I did to cover that up is I just shoved a bowl in front of it, and it covers it up and it looks pretty good. And then right here we have a soap canister that goes a little bit further than the sink that I masked out here using a mask material. So what I did is I just shoved Suzanne in front of the soap and it worked pretty well. And it gets some Blender publicity out there, yeah. And again, in the front here we have another mask where the wood is, which helps blend our CG counter with the real counter. So it is much less suspicious, I suppose would be a good word for that. The textures are very simple. I just painted them in Photoshop or threw them together in Photoshop. I made everything up except for the GIF brand. I hope they appreciate the advertising. And the bread material, as you can see, I just took some pictures of bread. But if you just have a flat image on bread, it's a little bit interesting. You can't just map a flat image on the bread or it looks completely fake. So what I did is I used a subsurf modifier to get it very, very high subdivision, and then I used a displacement modifier to make it bumpy. And then in the material, what I did was I took the image, desaturated it, and upped the contrast, and then applied that as a specular map. So there would be no specular highlights where the holes are on the bread, which would make it more believable. And the bread actually turned out pretty well. I was pretty pleased with how the bread came out. Initially, however, I had created some volumetric bread that I was pretty proud of, but it ended up taking 15 minutes per frame to render, which is not a very good render time. So I had to come up with a better way to handle the bread, and this is what I came up with. And again, it's not perfect, but I'm fairly pleased with it. On the second layer here with our reflection maps, I just took some pictures around the kitchen and shoved them on planes to give our objects something to reflect so they wouldn't look completely fake. The actual proper way to do this is to create an actual reflection map, a 360-degree reflection map, by taking a panorama of the area that you're using for your environment. But I was too lazy to do that this week, so I just took some images and shoved them on each side of the objects, and it worked. It worked fairly well. It's not perfect, but it worked fairly well. And then this plane right here, the blank one, does actually have a material on it. It is the video backdrop, because if I just let the counter reflect the world as a texture, the reflections came out all wrong. As you'll notice, the reflections need to be straight down. They didn't come out that way when I rendered them out using just the world for the background. So what I did to get proper reflections was I mapped the movie clip to a plane and shoved it behind everything and matched it size-wise with the camera. As you can see, the plane is matched very well to the camera, and I might have actually locked the position on this. Yeah, I locked the position and rotation and scale on this plane and parented it to the camera, so now whenever the camera moves, the plane moves with the camera. As you can see, if I move through here, it will probably intersect these objects. And that is how I achieved the reflections, and that's what this layer down here is for. So looking at layer 1 again, lighting was a very key factor in this week's project, and it was a fairly tough challenge. Essentially, I originally wanted to start lighting the scene just using spotlights, and you can see this just looks like an absolute mess. And I know spotlights are used a lot in the professional industry, and I got a pretty decent lighting setup, but I got better results using the area lamps of different colors. By the way, in real life, when you're lighting for real life, you're usually going to want to avoid using white lights, because no light is actually perfectly white, and especially when your camera adapts to the settings, the light is going to come out different colors. So my lamps this week we have blue for the outdoor lighting to match the footage. As you can see, it's very blue coming from over here. So I made any light coming from windows in my kitchen, I made those blue, and then the lights coming from the fluorescent lamps, I made those orange, essentially just simulating the scene. And the only shadow casting lamp I have is this one, the fluorescent lamp that's actually in the shot, which this lamp does not match the position of that lamp perfectly because it just didn't look right. Sometimes you have to cheat things to make them look right. Also, how I got the reflections on the glass jar to look pretty well was really just having all of these lamps, because if you look at real life objects, you'll realize they have lots of specular highlights as opposed to just one specular highlight, and that's what makes the reflections look realistic. In CG, the specular highlights are really just simulating reflections from light in real life. So if you have lots of them from the lots of light sources that are in a real scene, it tends to look more believable. And again, how I got the reflections and kept the background transparent was using render layers. So on the first render layer, we just have layer 1. On this render layer, we have stuff that I didn't even use because that layer is blank. That was just for testing something earlier. And then we have layers 1 and 2 and render layer 2. And then I render everything out in our actual scene. So when it renders just this layer, we get the reflections from the background plane, but it doesn't actually add the background plane to this footage, so we end up with a transparent background that we can composite later. Now the background image here, just so I could match up the footage with the animation, is just the movie clip using the movie clip functionality from the tomato branch. And another note on lighting, to match the lighting of the scene, a good thing to do is to put items in your scene and take pictures of them to observe the lighting before you try to match the lighting of the scene. Like get a white sphere or a styrofoam sphere or something and put it in the scene and take pictures and match the lighting that way. I did not do that, which made lighting an absolute pain this week. However, what I did do, since these textures on all of my objects are kind of complicated and I couldn't tell if the lighting matched perfectly, what I did do is I took a solid white matte sphere, matte as in it has no specular highlight. I took a solid white grayish matte sphere and shoved it in the scene, and when the lighting looked proper on that, I knew the lighting was correct. So that's a good tip there. But really, you really want to get a white object to put in your scene and take pictures of in real life to match the lighting, or else it's really going to be troublesome like it was for me this week. One more note, by the way, for transparency, again, it's very important under shading in your render panel. This is not your render panel, this is my materials panel. That's why it's not there. Under your render panel, if you take a look at your shading, you will realize that the alpha is pre-multiplied. And that is very important to get good reflections, especially on transparent objects like this shiny bread here, which the material on this is kind of fun. It's just transparent and has a high specular highlight. And a note on materials, guys, is don't just use the default Lambert Cooktore materials, because the different types of materials cater to different kinds of objects. Like the Lambert worked fine for this, but then I wanted to use a wordless, so I don't know how to pronounce that, specular highlight, because it produces a more shiny, smaller, harder specular highlight, while as opposed to the bread, we use the Cooktore specular highlight because it can give us very soft specular highlights, and it worked very well with my specular map. And I used the Orinair material here because it generates rough materials like the bread. And I used the Cooktor, I used the Wordlizo, I'm just going to call it Words though, again on the jars for those highlights. Let me actually show you the difference between the Words though and the Cooktor. If I click on Words though, you can see it's very hard. If I click on Cooktor, you can see it's very soft. So you really want to switch between different kinds of specular highlights for different kinds of materials. It's very useful. One more tip is, in real life, no matter what angle you look at anything, almost anything is going to be reflective from some angle. Even your skin, if you look at it from a very steep angle, is reflective. So I literally try to apply reflections to almost everything in my scene except for the bread and the juice box and a couple other things. But even matte objects are reflective if you look at them from an angle. Try it. It's kind of neat, and it adds a lot of realism to your scene if you use reflections tastefully. So, get a little bit ahead of myself there. Let's move on to the node editor to take a look at the compositing this week, since the 3D was very straightforward this week. Just a bunch of tedious modeling and animation, but hard work and dedication makes your work look good. So put the effort into the modeling and lighting, and the compositing will be a piece of cake for you, as you'll see here. Here I took out the render passes in cases I wanted to combine them later, but I actually had some issues combining them. I couldn't get the refractive jar to look right on that when I tried later just for fun. Luckily, my render by itself looked pretty decent though. So the actual compositing of the scene looks like this. We take the initial image over here to our vector blur, which is like motion blur but faster, and it's not physically accurate, but it looks pretty decent. And we take that into a sharpen blur, then sharpen node to dirty up the footage, sort of, to match our dirty camera footage, because let's look at this. We were taking fluorescently lit footage, which is never going to be of good quality. So if we take perfectly high quality, pristine 3D models and shove them into the grainy, fluorescently lit footage, it's not going to look very believable. So then even further dirtying it up, I overlaid some colored clouds noise onto it, which helped add realism again. And then at this point I took the CG, which was only on one layer this week, yes, and I alpha overed it onto our movie clip using a factor of 1. And since I rendered out with pre-multiply, I didn't even have to use an alpha map for the factor of the alpha over. It just worked. Then up here I added a glare node with a fog glow just to add a slight glow to any super high specular highlights in the scene, because it adds realism. If things are blown out in real world, the glow tends to bleed onto the actual footage. So how I did that is I took the image over here, I desaturated it completely and upped the contrast, and then added the glare node and used a fog glow node. So what that looks like is this, if this will actually render out for us, as you can see. And then I took that and screened it over by a factor of half. Now it's very orange. Then I color graded the whole thing. I've been told it's actually too blue. I need to be more sensitive on my color gradings, apparently. So I'll look into that in the future, but I didn't get to fix that this week because it's took 20-something hours to render and I was already out of time. But I actually personally did the blue on purpose because I felt like the blue would add a magic-y tone to it. So I kind of like it, but I guess it's up to personal preference. I mean, art is completely subjective. So I'll be more careful about that in the future. Another neat tip, guys, by the way, that I've been doing is you can hit Control-Shift and just click on nodes to change the viewer node to look at that node, rather than having a bunch of nodes, or a bunch of viewer nodes for each one. I learned that tip from Sebastian_K on the forums. He is very good with the compositor, and I appreciate that tip a lot. It helped save me a lot of headache. So thank you for that, sir. And then finally, after the color grading and contrasting and color fixing, using some curves node, the color balance node, etc., I just added a simple vignette over, which I took any texture image, I scaled it down, I lens distorted it, I did a greater than node, value 0, to make it purely black and white, then blurred it. That is an Andrew Price tip from Blender Guru. and I love that tip because I love vignettes personally. A lot of people hate them and think they're unprofessional, but I think they look pretty swell. And then I multiply the vignette over the image by a factor of 0.5 because going up too high just doesn't look great. Got to keep it subtle for a vignette to look good in my opinion, depending on your context of course. And that's all the compositing there was this week. It was very, very simple, just taking the image, dirtying it up, and shoving it over the footage, and color grading everything together. Because color grading everything together, by the way, helps make the CG fit in with the footage even better, because the footage and the color grading, the footage and the 3D models were color graded together, so it adds to the effect. It really helps blend it in better. So then, what I didn't mention last week is I've actually also been using Blender to put the video files together for these projects. So what I do for that is I treat Blender as its own video editing software, so I open up a separate window of Blender to do the video editing, just to prevent any issues or lag or anything like that. And I took all of the images and footage I did. I also did the text in Blender, by the way. I'll show you how I did that. I just took an orthographic camera, and made some text in Blender and used the Arial font because I'm a fan of Arial Black, and rendered that out shadeless to get the color of text that I wanted, and then I saved that as an image and imported those into here. So I'm going to turn off audio scrubbing here so we don't get that in our video, and you can see then it's very simple to just take the strips and put them together. You can also do transitions between different videos, but I decided not to do that this week because it was supposed to be a cheesy sort of instructional video with music that sort of fit the cheesy style. The title slide, I just took the scene and rendered it out up close up with depth of field because I was pretty proud of that bread there, and I added some text and rendered that out. And then we have the video here that I rendered out, just the image sequence. And the sequence editor is very, very straightforward and simple to use. If you've used Premiere or After Effects at all, it matches up almost perfectly. Then I created all the sound effects myself. I just took my iPad downstairs and recorded the sound effects on the counter, because recording in the actual environment helped get accurate sound effects. And the music I got from freesound.org. The guy's username that I got it from was Texas Music Forge, which I appreciate that, sir. The freesound.org, a link will probably, or a name that you can Google will probably appear in the YouTube video if I'm not lazy this week. Freesound.org is great. You can find any sorts of sound effects or anything you need under the Creative Commons license to use on your videos for commercial or non-commercial usage, and it's fantastic since I've always had problems finding free music. And then I did some credits and enjoy. And that concludes our breakdown for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please post them below. I also appreciate suggestions for future topics. I know I haven't covered the ones that you guys have suggested yet, but I have added them to my list and I will go over them in the future. I probably won't have a video next week because I'm moving back into school, but all weeks after that I'm going to try to do a video on a weekly basis. So again, I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. I hope it was informative for you. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel because there's plenty more where this came from. I suppose that's all. Chris Folia, peace out.